everyone. It's Brother Donnie, Country Homestead Preacher. Hope you're having a good evening today. I'm back from my trip doing revival meetings down in South Alabama. We had a fruitful meeting and do up there. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Now, this evening, I'm going to finish up a message that I started when I was down south preaching, and the message was stand or you'll fall. Now, the problem is my phone, it only recorded about 13 minutes of that message. So I'm going to have to finish the message here, and I apologize for that, and maybe in the future I can get a better recording device. But the message is still the same. I have the same notes that I used in the message the other night. And for the first video, if you remember, we left off was in Exodus chapter 14, I believe it was, and we were talking about Moses and the children coming out of Egypt. And if you'll remember, we had just commented that God had brought them to a place to where they were literally boxed in. They couldn't go backwards. They couldn't go forward. They had mountains. If you looked at this place on a map, they literally, God boxed them in. They had the Red Sea in front of them, so they were literally stranded. But I'm going to tell you, there was a purpose for them being stranded. And in the Bible, we see where God gave Moses specific instructions to where they were to camp. And remember, the whole Egyptian army was coming after them. God had put them in a place where they was going to have to rely on him. And we see Moses' conviction when he camped and he was obedient to where God told him to be. The question for us, beloved, is if we're going to stand, we have to make a stand based on what he has told us to do. And the way that we make that stand is, or the way that we know that what he's told us to do is through God's word. Now, notice here in Exodus 14, picking up in verse number 10, the Bible says, and as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, is it because there was no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Now, this is the same group who not too long from then had seen God deliver them out of Egypt. They had seen the plagues. They had seen the Passover where death came through and killed the firstborn that did not have the blood on the doorpost. They had witnessed all that stuff. But yet, because they're in a hard place here, that God has put them in a hard place, they're belly aching and crying. And Moses has to calm them. Look what it says in verse number 13. Now this is Moses, this is his resolve here. Notice. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Now, so what you have here is Moses, because he has a conviction, he's standing on principles, he is telling the people, we're going to stay right here and just watch what God does. You see, beloved, in our life, we have opportunities to stand or run. And what's happening too often is, if you watched video number 1, what's happening too often is the church these days, and many Christians are cowering down to the schemes of the enemy. And we're not holding our ground. We're not taking a stand for righteousness. We're letting just everything pass through. But Moses told him, he says, no, stand right here. Look, notice in 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. And as far as for you, lift up your staff and stretch your hand over the sea and divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. So they had come to this place. They were trapped in. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't go backwards. But here, God looks at Moses and said, tell them to go forward. tell them to go towards the sea. Beloved, when you and I take a stand for Christ, and it seems like that we are at the end of the rope and that there is roadblocks ahead, I'm going to tell you, he can open an impossible way. It was impossible for man to be able to do this. But God told Moses, he said, raise your staff. He raised his staff. And I love verse 16, the very end part of it. It says, and you shall go through the sea on dry land. So when God told Moses to raise his staff, the sea was split in the middle and the ground was dry. And I'm telling you folks, how dry was it? It was so dry that dust padded up because of that dry ground, because of what God had done. And of course, when the lesson in this verse is that when we have come to the end of the block and are boxed in, God will make a way while we're taking a stand. And we know what happened. The children of Israel went through. They made it through safely. The waters came down, killed all the Egyptians. And it's interesting, I read I saw a documentary that they have found where they believe that the children crossed. They have found wagon wheels in the sand about 25 below the bottom of the sea where slag and everything had come back over, but they have found wagon wheels. They have found bones. This was this really happened. And Moses took a stand all because he has convictions. What about you? Do you take stands? Now, another example I use is in the book of 1 Samuel when we talk about King David. And, you know, up until this point in the life of David, no one has really given David a whole lot of credit for anything. He's just a little, he's nothing but a shepherd boy out taking care. As a matter of fact, when Samuel goes to anoint him, his father didn't even think enough of him to bring him in the house with his other sons. But yet we see here in the famous story of David and Goliath, of David showing conviction, having resolve, and the expectation that comes. If you'll notice 1 Samuel chapter 17. And back at this time, it was common for two opposing armies to send a champion. And the Philistines sent Goliath, and he was a great big fellow. He was 9 foot tall, I think 9'6", big old huge man. And he just towered above everyone. And people were absolutely petrified. But let's pick up in verse number 26 here. I want to show you David's conviction. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Notice, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should taunt the armies of the living God? Now, it was bad that Goliath was threatening Israel. But what's worse for David, David recognized that Goliath was actually taunting God. Because it says, this Philistine, that he should taunt the armies of the living God. So David, he grouped the armies of God in with God. And what would happen, the conviction that he had, was what was offending God was offending him. And that's a question for us today. Are you far enough along in your relationship with Christ to where you can say that what offends Christ offends you? The things that you see with your eyes, the things that you hear with your ears, are you able to hear these things and it not offend you because it offends God? David had great conviction here. Notice what happened. And the people answered him according with his words, saying, thus it will be done for the man who kills him. Now here's old David's brothers who, again, they didn't give him no regard. He wasn't nothing but old shepherd boy out in the field. Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. So let's understand this now. When you take a stand, when you have conviction on something, There's always going to be opposition pointed your way. And David's opposition here to start with was his own family. And I know in my wife, in our life, myself and my wife's life and our family, we've taken stands on certain things, certain holidays that we don't participate in, certain holidays that we don't go full board in, other things that we don't do. Just several things. And we have faced opposition. But I'm going to tell you, if you have a conviction, and if God has given you a conviction, don't worry about the opposition. There'll always be opposition. David even had opposition. Now notice his resolve here. Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before. And when the words which David spoke were heard, and they told to Saul, he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And then Saul's going to be opposing him. Then Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth." But now this is resolve here, all because he had a conviction. But David said to Saul, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep, and a lion or a bear came and took the lamb from the flock. I went after him, I attacked him and rescued him, and I seized him by his beard and struck and killed him. And your servant has killed both the lion and the bear," and I love this part, "and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them." Here it goes again, back to his conviction. Since he has taunted the armies of the living God. You see, that's the conviction that David rested on, and his resolve came from that conviction. And of course we know the expectation. We know what happened. David was able to kill Goliath. He had already been, previous chapters, anointed king, and he was going to take over one day. But the point of the story is this, beloved, that if we don't take stands as believers, we will fall. And what's more, if we don't take stands as believers, our families will fall. When God calls you to do right, when he gives you a conviction to do right, you stand on that conviction and you don't move from it. And then you're going to have opposition, and then you're going to have things come against you. But listen, beloved, you have resolve. You remember I pointed out in the first video 3 things when it comes to standing: conviction, resolve, and expectation. And if you stand on conviction, you have the resolve to fight. You have the expectation that he is going to see you through every time. There's many other stories in the Bible. I could tell you about Daniel. I could tell you about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I could tell you about Peter. I could tell you about Paul. I mean, many other examples we have in the scriptures of those who stood and had conviction and had resolve and had expectation. Let me tell you something. God has called people to stand. We're not some Christians who are scared of our shadow, where we go and stick our heads under the sand. I want to tell you something. We serve God. We are in the army of the living God, just like David was fighting for. We are in the army of the living God, and he will take care of us. Well, beloved, I hope this video has found you well this evening. And I apologize again for not having the preaching portion where I was preaching in front of the church for this video, but I hope it's blessed you. And on Wednesday or Thursday, I'll try to get a video on Chronicles, on Colossians. If there's anything I can do for you, email me, put it in the comments. If there's somebody you think this will bless, forward it to them. And this is Brother Donnie, Country Homestead Preacher, and we are trying to change the world one verse at a time. Good night.